So I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a trigger warning that the very end of this episode, after the credits roll and everything happens, the very last image that's going to flash across the screen is going to be an actual crime scene photo of this person that I'm going to be talking about in today's episode. That's your warning. If you don't think that you can stick around and watch that, I'm not going to be upset if you cut out during the credits. It's not very often that I get to present an episode of History Happens that happened during my lifetime. Most of the stuff I focus on happened around the Victorian era or earlier, because that's the era that I tend to be most fascinated by. But today's actually happened in 1982. And on June 18th of 1982, London woke beneath low clouds and pale morning skies that seemed undecided about rain. Well, that's how almost every morning in London is. The river moved slowly beneath Blackfriars Bridge. Commuters crossed overhead, carrying their briefcases and newspapers and shopping bags and private anxieties. Most of them never looked downward. Cities tend to teach people not to look too closely at the unpleasant things. It's one of the small skills required to survive among millions of strangers, and those of us who've lived in big cities know this all too well. Then a postal worker looked over the side of the bridge and saw a man hanging beneath the scaffolding. There are sites that divide a day into these before and after moments. I remember getting up on the morning of September 11th and getting ready for work. Barely. It was a normal day. It was very average. And by the time I got into work, I had noticed that the lines at the gas station were kind of long. And by the time I walked into work, the second plane was just striking the second tower. I know exactly that feeling of having your day divided between the before and the after. Well, that was one of those days for this poor postman, and for pretty much everybody else who was involved in the case after this in 1982. So the postman, what he found was a dead man who was wearing an expensive suit. His shoes still appeared to be polished. This is important. The bricks were bulged inside of his pockets, so his pockets were loaded down with bricks. The Thames River drifted quietly beneath him while traffic continued overhead, and for a few moments, London behaved exactly as London always had, which is somehow making the scene a little bit more disturbing for this poor postman. Death does not stop cities. It just doesn't. It merely hides among them. The body that we're talking about belonged to a man by the name of Roberto Calvi. At the time, he was one of the most controversial bankers in all of Europe. People called him God's banker. Well, that nickname sounds theatrical now, almost too perfect for fiction, but it came from his deep financial connections to the Vatican Bank. Newspapers loved the phrase because it carried both reverence and suspicion, like in equal measure. It suggested a man who moved easily through corridors most people could never, ever expect to see in their entire lifetime. Corridors lined with polished wood, discreet conversations, religious influence, political bargaining and intrigue, enormous sums of money, and more than one scandal. I'm sure we're all aware of that. And by June of 1982, almost all of it was collapsing. Now, before we continue, it's important to understand something about this man that was just found dead, Roberto Calvi. Men like him do not usually appear dangerous at first glance. If you're watching this episode, you can see his picture up on the screen beside me here. He doesn't look like a dangerous guy. He looks like a very normal man. And men like this that don't appear dangerous on the surface, they really don't shout at people. They don't threaten people. They don't really arrive carrying revolvers or knives. They don't walk around being the threat. Instead, they carry paperwork. They sign documents. They nod politely across tables while fortunes completely vanish quietly into offshore accounts. Calvi had risen through the Banco Ambrosiano, and this was one of Italy's largest private banks. He was intelligent and disciplined and ambitious. He understood banking the way most men understand games like chess. Not merely the rules, but the psychology behind them. He understood hesitation, and he understood greed, and he understood fear, and he understood how to play these things. And perhaps most dangerously, he understood secrecy. By the late 1970s, Banco Ambrosiano had become tangled in a complicated international transaction series involving shell companies, hidden debts, foreign transfers, offshore accounts that were spread across multiple countries. Investigators later discovered enormous sums of money moving through channels so confusing that even experienced financial authorities struggled to follow them and to pick up the pieces and the trails. There are crimes that are committed in alleys, sure. There are crimes that are committed in offices. And then there's crimes committed so high above ordinary life that they scarcely resemble crimes at all until everything collapses beneath their weight. Calvi stood near the center of that entire collapse. In 1981, he was convicted of illegally exporting millions of dollars out of Italy. He received a suspended sentence and remained free pending his appeal. During a brief period in jail, he attempted to take his own life. His family insisted that he was being manipulated by larger forces around him, but others believed that he had simply been caught after years of dangerous financial games. Well, perhaps both things were true. That possibly sits uneasily in this storm from beginning to end as being a very real possibility. Because the deeper one looks into Robert Calvi's life, the harder it becomes to separate victim from participant. And then there was propaganda due. Even the name sounds financially fictional, like something a novelist might invent and later tone down for realism. But P2, as it was known, Propaganda 2, was real. It was a secretive Masonic lodge linked to politicians, military officers, intelligence figures, businessmen, men whose occupations became vague whenever journalists asked too many questions. Its leader was a man by the name of Licio Gelli, a man who seemed to know everyone worth knowing, and perhaps several people worth outright avoiding. Calvi belonged to this P2 organization. Members reportedly referred to themselves as the Blackfriars. That detail matters because Robert Calvi's body was discovered beneath Blackfriars Bridge. Now, perhaps that was just a coincidence. History contains many coincidences, but this one particular coincidence arrived carrying bricks in its pockets. And people did notice this. People always notice symbolism when a corpse appears in public, especially when powerful institutions are already trembling. Because by June of 1982, Banco Ambrosiano, let me just stutter over myself here long enough, was collapsing beneath debts estimated somewhere between several $100 million and $1.5 billion, depending on whose figures you might trust. The numbers changed constantly. That itself was alarming, sure. Money had vanished and documents had vanished. Confidence, too, had vanished. And once confidence in banking is gone, you lose it all. Confidence in banking is everything. Without confidence, bank is merely an expensive building filled with nervous little men. A few days before his death, Calvi wrote a desperate letter to Pope John Paul II, warning that the collapse of the Banco Ambrosiano could bring catastrophic damage to the church itself. It was not the sort of letter a calm man would write. It reads like the words of someone staring directly at disaster or a detective novel. Then almost immediately afterward, everything unraveled. Calvi disappeared from Rome using a false passport. His secretary, Graziella, threw herself from a fifth-floor window at the bank headquarters after leaving behind a furious note condemning the damage that he had caused. I'm going to say allegedly here. And Calvi fled across Europe. These are 3 different events, 3 different collapses, 3 different warnings. The rule of threes appears often in mysteries because human beings instinctively start to understand and recognize patterns. The first event might unsettle us. The second concerns us. But the third convinces us something terrible is truly happening. By the time Calvi reached London, he was frightened. Witnesses later described him as exhausted and agitated. Heck, I would be too. He checked into a flat under an assumed identity, and he carried cash in several currencies. He met with people whose names surfaced later in investigations involving organized crime and secret financial dealings. And then he died beneath Blackfriars Bridge. At first, authorities ruled the death as one where he would have taken his own life. That conclusion satisfied some people immediately because exhausted and disgraced financiers occasionally do take their own lives. Public humiliation has ended many lives in this way. Financial collapse destroys more than just fortunes. It destroys complete identities. But other details felt wrong pretty much immediately. There were the bricks in the pockets. I do keep coming back to that. And there was the location itself. There was the awkward positioning of the body beneath the scaffolding. There were the polished shoes, when surely his shoes would have gotten muddy. And there was one question that refused to disappear. How exactly had he gotten there? Years later, forensic investigators began examining the case more carefully. Their conclusion changed everything. Tests did show that Calvi's shoes lacked the rust and paint residue expected if he had climbed across the scaffolding himself. Injuries on his neck appeared inconsistent with someone taking their own lives. Even stranger evidence suggested he had never handled the bricks found in his own pockets. The residue wasn't on his hands. That detail remains one of the most chilling in the entire case. Imagine that for a moment, someone placing bricks into another man's pockets, either before or after he's already dead. It is intimate in a terrible way, methodical, calm, almost ceremonial. Investigators eventually developed a theory that Calvi had been transported by boat along the Thames before being staged beneath the bridge, which raises another disturbing image. A frightened banker sitting silently in a boat at night under a dark bridge on dark water, surrounded perhaps by men he knew, men he feared, or men that maybe he once trusted. He made no dramatic speeches, I'm sure. Probably no time for a confession, no final bargain. Just the slow realization that the meeting was never meant to end with his survival. That possibility hangs over this case like a dense fog. And fog, as every mystery reader knows, has a way of making ordinary things appear sinister. Soon the theories multiplied. Mafia informants claimed Calvi had lost mob money through Banco Ambrosiano and paid for it with his life. Others pointed toward P2 and its powerful members, the Blackfriars. Some suspected the Vatican feared exposure in all of this. They'd already been exposed for so many things, so to speak, allegedly. Others believed intelligence services had reason to silence him. Still others thought Calvi knew too many secrets about too many powerful people and had become impossible to protect safely. There were so many people that could have done this. They all had motives. Trials followed, arrests followed, accusations followed, and yet certainty never did arrive. Several men were eventually charged with involvement in this man's murder, including mafia-linked figures and associates tied to that group known as P2. The trial stretched over years. Evidence appeared, witnesses contradicted one another, memories faded, some suspects even died, others vanished into silence. In the end, all were acquitted. Not because the court declared Robert O'Calvey innocent or safe or misunderstood, but the court accepted that he had likely been killed. He had been murdered, but proving precisely who had ordered it proved almost impossible. And perhaps that is fitting in a grim sort of way, because this was never merely a murder mystery. It was a story about systems, institutions, about the strange relationship between power and secrecy. Most people imagine corruption as something noisy and obvious and right in front of you or surrounded by conspiracies. But real corruption is often administrative. It arrives through signatures and approvals and discreet meetings and careful accounting and favors exchanged quietly among educated people wearing expensive watches and expensive suits and nice fedoras. That's why stories like this unsettle so many of us so deeply. They suggest entire structures may rest upon understanding the public never sees it. And Roberto Calvi spent years inside of those structures. Perhaps too many years. There's another sadness behind this story that deserves mentioning too. Calvi was not some mythical criminal mastermind standing above ordinary human weaknesses. By many accounts, he became increasingly frightened near the end. He appeared isolated, pressured, concerned. Men who spend years believing they understand the game sometimes discover too late that they themselves are the pawns on the board. That realization destroys people. And maybe that is why his death still lingers in public memory after all these decades. Not because it involved only money or religion or crime, but because it touched all three at the same time. Faith, greed, and fear. Three forces capable of moving nations and ruining lives. History happens where those forces collide. Sometimes in palaces, sometimes in banks, and sometimes beneath bridges. At dawn, spotted by a postman who will never forget that day. Today, Blackfriars Bridge still stands over the Thames. People walk across it every single day without thinking about Roberto Calvi. Tourists take photographs nearby, posing, hanging out there with their coffees, scrolling on their phones. Office workers hurry toward meetings. Boats drift beneath the arches. London continues. Cities always do. But somewhere beneath the ordinary rhythm of traffic and river water remains the memory of a banker hanging in silence while powerful men across Europe waited nervously to see what secrets might surface next. Perhaps that's the most haunting thing of all of this. After decades of investigations and trials and theories and speculation, nobody can say with complete certainty who killed Robert Calvi. Yet almost nobody believes that he did it himself. That leaves the story suspended in an uncomfortable place between truth and silence, like a body hanging beneath a bridge while the river keeps moving below. So here's the question for you to answer if you are watching this on Facebook or if you are on YouTube. I know you can't answer these questions on the podcast platforms because most of them don't offer you that availability and space. So there's a good reason to go and follow me on YouTube and on the Facebook page. But your question for today, do you believe the most dangerous secrets in history are usually protected by fear, by money, or by the simple unwillingness of ordinary people to believe how deeply corruption can truly spread? Thanks for watching. I'll be back with more tomorrow.